God can do anything therapy can't. God can do anything I can't. But I'll help you give it your best shot.
Welcome to Coach Soul, the podcast where we explore therapeutic ways to the best versions of ourselves. I'm your host, Steve Hudgins. I'm a licensed professional counselor dedicated to helping you navigate life's challenges. In each uplifting episode, we'll discuss mental health, relationships, self-care, emotional well-being, and personal growth. Join me and with my co-host, Kenya Evelyn, a therapeutic life coach, where sometimes we'll even welcome special guests to our show that share their experience and expertise. So let's embark on this transformative path together and discover a healthier and happier you. All right, welcome back to Coach Soul. What a privilege to start off the year. I have a special guest with us, Bowden McElroy, who has been a licensed therapist for quite a while. I don't want to give it too much away because you look kind of young to me, Bowden.
Thanks.
How long you been doing therapy?
Since 1983. So in May, it'll be 42 years.
So congratulations with 40 plus years. I'm still a baby in this stuff. I do have life experience, but doing therapy since 2012. So 13 years underneath my belt with your 40. That's why I have you on my show. You're the expert on this topic of narcissism. And I just think that Dr. Google, everybody goes to Dr. Google for their diagnosis and they label themselves and people say, okay, Bowden, you disagree with me. So you must be a narcissist because you're not opening minded here. Kind of give us a viewpoint of what is narcissism by the DSM-5 that we as therapists go by.
So, narcissistic personality disorder. So we got to break that down. Personality disorder for therapists, it means something that's rooted in childhood. It's how you view the world. It's how you interact with the world. And modern psychology pretty much assumes that once you have a personality disorder, that cannot be fixed. You will always have it. The prevailing wisdom in the psychological world is that people can learn to moderate that, but they never completely get rid of it, right? So it's kind of like having asthma or diabetes. You don't always get rid of it, but you learn to manage it. You can live a pretty normal life, right? So that's the first thing, is that it's a personality disorder. It's rooted in childhood. It's how you see the world. Narcissism comes from the Greek myth of Narcissus, who was the guy that was so in love with his own image that staring at it in the pond that he fell in and drowned. His self-love became the ultimate self-harm, right? So narcissistic personality disorder is someone who is so self-absorbed that it colors their entire world and dictates all of their behavior. Okay, you with me so far?
When you think about what you're sharing of self-love, but it's rooted in childhood, what are some of the things that happen in childhood for, a mother wound, father wound, both? Kind of give a background about what you mean by childhood trauma or anything that happens in childhood that causes a person to become narcissistic.
So most narcissistic personality disorders are men, not women, although it's not exclusive to men. We're seeing more and more narcissistic women. If you wanted to raise a narcissistic man, Steve, you would start as a boy and you would convince him that nothing is ever his fault. He is your perfect little angel and he can do no wrong. If the coach doesn't put him in on the starting five, it's because that's a lousy basketball coach. If the teacher gives him a B or a C instead of an A+, it's because that teacher doesn't know how to teach. If the school calls with a problem, before you even find out what your perfect little angel did, you've already contacted an attorney and you've stormed down to the superintendent's office. So if you want to raise a narcissistic child, you convince them that A, they are the center of your universe, B, they can do nothing wrong, and C, anytime something goes wrong in their life, it is always someone else's fault.
Mm.
There's different kinds of narcissistic personalities, but the main one that we're concerned about, and the main one that we see in counseling, is the person who thinks that they are just all that. Academically, vocationally. There's another kind of narcissism that it's typically men who are romantic narcissists that see themselves as just God's gift to women. We talk about covert and overt narcissism. I don't want to get into too much of that because we only have 30 minutes. But basically, this notion of narcissism is the world revolves around you. You can do no wrong. And if something wrong happens, it's always somebody else's fault.
Now, Bowden, it's pretty interesting that you commented, and we know this because we're both therapists. We kind of work together in the same office. One of the things that I do want to bring out is the difference between men and women. What causes the men to have so much more narcissism than women? And then is in diagnosing for women, is it more the borderline is a trait of a narcissist? Kind of expound on that a little bit more about why do men have it more than women?
So let's define borderline, since you brought that word up. It used to mean, it came about way back in the day, because it described people who were on the border of schizophrenia or psychosis. It doesn't mean that anymore. We know better than that now. And so what it really describes is someone with a lot of anger and no sense of self, right? Just kind of chronically angry at the world. Who they see themselves as changes from day to day or from situation to situation. It seems to be the narcissistic male and the borderline female find one another, and it is a match made in hell. If you get a couple of those couples on your caseload, it will be very challenging, and you will never want for a lack of patience, because they will always show up, right? And even after the marriage falls apart, they will continue to show up. It's really interesting. Sometimes I'll get blamed that, I'm the reason their marriage fell apart. And so I'll have people calling me, leaving messages, telling me what a horrible person I am and what a terrible therapist I am, for about 4, 6, 8 weeks. And then all of a sudden they show up in my schedule. They're in my office. You're the only person who ever understood me. You're the only counselor who was ever actually helpful to me. That's a real hint that that's someone who's that borderline. That sense of self is very vague. So your question was, why do we see more men who are narcissists and women who are borderline? That's the magic question. That's an area for someone to do much more research in. Somebody needs to write their dissertation on that. But basically, it goes back to this notion of narcissism is formed by my little boy is a perfect angel, nothing's ever wrong with him. Borderline is often formed by trauma and abuse in childhood. And we know that little girls tend to get abused and molested far more often than little boys. So we're going to see more women who are borderline, more men who are narcissistic. It always throws me for a curve when I find a borderline male or narcissistic female. Mm-hmm. They're out there, they exist. They come into counseling every now and then. You kind of have to be in tune for it, otherwise it'll sneak up on you.
We kind of use that term narcissism loosely, though.
I do?
No, the society tends to use narcissism, term kind of loosely.
Oh, there are a couple of statements that if people utter them, I want to run screaming from my office, right? One is it doesn't really count as an affair because he or she was my soulmate. I hear that, and I just want to scream and throw them out. I don't, but inside I want to. And the other one is, and it's primarily women that come into my office, and the first words out of their mouth are, my husband, my boyfriend, is a narcissist.
Correct.
Not everybody who is a selfish SOB has a narcissistic personality disorder. You can be selfish because we're all selfish, right? That's part of the fallen nature. That's the sin nature. As a Christian counselor, I don't believe, I'm not a humanistic therapist. I don't believe that lurking within each of us is an inner god or goddess just waiting to come out. I believe that lurking within each of us is an inner toddler that wants what it wants, and it wants it 5 minutes ago. It's that sin nature. We just can't help but wanting what we want, and we all get selfish. The difference between someone who's selfish and someone who's a narcissist is a narcissist, number one, they're that way 24/7. I see a lot of men who are very selfish in their marriage, but nowhere else. That's a marital issue. That's not a personality disorder. That's a marital issue. And so I think that, we have to be very careful with how we define that. If you're a narcissist, you're a narcissist 24/7. If you're a narcissist, it just means that the world revolves around you. It doesn't mean that you're malignant or malicious or evil. There's a lot of really nice guys out there who are narcissists. They would give you the shirt off their back if it ever occurred to them you needed a shirt. See, the narcissist, I'm thinking back, 17, 18 years ago in Tulsa, we had an ice storm right at Christmas time. Mm-hmm. Electricity was out all over town. And every now and then you would see these pockets, these little neighborhoods or streets that, some of the houses had electricity. And what was happening was family and friends were camping out in one of these few houses that still had electricity on. And so you can imagine a narcissist sitting in this room and someone is just shivering because they're cold. And the narcissist has a whole closet full of shirts and sweaters and a whole closet full of coats. And he can be a generous person. He would be happy to give you a coat. It's just that it doesn't occur to him you need one because he's comfortable. He's got his sweater on. Life is good. And so he doesn't think about anybody else, right? But once someone points it out to him, hey, this guy needs a coat, they're generous. They'll go give it to him. They're not always malignant, evil people. A lot of times they're nice people. They're just selfish and thoughtless. And by thoughtless, I mean that literally. They just don't think about other people. It doesn't occur to them. And that's where we see them in marriage counseling so much. The spouse, typically the wife, is just fed up. It's been 10, 20, 30 years of not being thought about, and they're done. They're done with that. And that's when the narcissist is just completely surprised. I had no idea because I thought my marriage was great. I assumed you thought the marriage was great. I had no idea you were unhappy. When that happens, we refer to that as the narcissistic wound. You can imagine a big bubble that gets popped or burst. And that's when the narcissist can no longer blame someone else. The events that have occurred in their life are so traumatic in some form or fashion that they realize it's them. And as a therapist, you have to strike while the iron's hot. Because if you give them enough time, they will convince themselves it wasn't really their fault after all. So when I get a phone call from somebody that wants to come in, and I have a suspicion that they're narcissistic, I don't put them in a week or two. I work them in much more quickly. Otherwise, I'll lose them. 2 weeks down the road, they've convinced themselves that it wasn't their fault after all. It was always someone else's. But if I can get them in my office, then I can begin to point out how maybe the world doesn't operate the way they think it does. Maybe the world doesn't really revolve around them. So I tell the candidates that I supervise, I tell new therapists, sometimes when you have this narcissistic wound, our inclination as therapists is to be very supportive and encouraging and healing. I need to find that wound and step on it, grind it a little bit, help them to feel pain so that they'll stick with it. They'll understand, I've got to do something about this.
And oftentimes you and I get fired when we step on that wound too.
Sometimes,
So when you think about narcissism, you mentioned earlier the overt, the covert, a variety of different things. What I want to kind of look at is when you think about the majority of men that have it, let's talk about talking points between men and women. What are some of the signs that men carry that are narcissistic? And then women, what are some of the signs there? Because I think signs are important to pick up and notice, because a lot of people just say, that person, because you disagree with me or whatever, you're a narcissist, or because you do this, you're a narcissist. So what are the telltale signs of narcissism in men and women?
it's the same sign. And the number one red flag is nothing is ever their fault. It's the boss's fault. It's the customer's fault. It's the wife's fault. It's the kid's fault. Nothing is ever their fault. So I get men who will come into my office and they will admit freely, I am selfish. I have a hard time with that. And I need to do something about it. I had a guy come in, early 30s, successful, nice guy. And the first words out of his mouth were, I need help growing into my maturity. Well, he was at the right place. That's what I do. I help men, Christian men, grow into their spiritual and emotional maturity. What he meant by that, when he began to break it down, was he had a series of failed relationships. And he recognized that after a series of failed relationships, he recognized he was the common denominator. There had to be something it was not. He wouldn't come out and say, and most of these guys won't come out and say, something's wrong with me. What they will say is, I'm missing a piece. Help me understand. It's help me understand women better, instead of help me be less selfish. But that's the entree. That's my open door that I can begin to go through. I can help you understand women better. And in doing that, I'm going to help them look at themselves more honestly and more realistically.
But Bowden, you and I hear marriage couples say, I didn't see this. How did they get themselves stuck in a relationship that becomes narcissistic? And they didn't see it at first. He must have changed during marriage. But I always say he's always been. And so kind of expound that a little bit more.
Well, first of all, not all of those marriages have a narcissistic personality disorder.
Correct.
Remember, it's 24/7. So if it's just in the marriage, that's a relationship issue. And the question that you're asking me is, how can some people, men and women both, be so clueless in their marriage? Part of it is that selfishness. Part of it is, that idea that I'm okay, therefore we must be okay. Part of it is they stopped feeling connected years ago and convinced themselves that we don't argue, we don't fight, we're good parents, we're productive citizens, we go to church, therefore we have a good marriage. When deep inside, there's no connection there. There's no emotional intimacy. One of them recognizes that more quickly and feels it more vividly than the other. And so the one who is slower to recognize it, who doesn't feel it as deeply, they're the ones caught by surprise. How did this happen to me? I thought things were good. Well, you define good. We didn't argue. The absence of conflict is not the same as good. Right? The absence of conflict is just baseline. It's not the same as good. Well, we didn't argue. We're good parents. We have sex on a regular basis. We don't have any other problems. I like her parents. She likes my parents. But again, the absence of conflict is not the same as emotional and spiritual connection. And so I think, to answer your question, that's a lot of what I hear. My spouse is narcissistic. No, they're not. You just have been unwilling to admit that your marriage has been on autopilot for a long time, and it caught you by surprise.
It's challenging when all of a sudden the eyes are open and it's like, okay, what is behind these couples that wait till the last minute to say, hey, we need some help here. And it's like we are a genie in a bottle. They rub us the right way and poof, we can magically, repair this marriage. But the difficulty that comes in working with these types of marriages stems from the narcissistic male. Would that be accurate or not?
Where there is, in fact, a true narcissistic male in the marriage, they're difficult to stay married to.
Okay. And the reason being?
Most secular psychologists will tell you that don't even try. The personality disorder is there, and it will be toxic to the relationship. Don't even try. Well, as a Christian counselor, I have a hard time believing that there's no hope there whatsoever. Now, I do have to tell people that, God can do anything therapy can't. God can do anything I can't. But I'll help you give it your best shot. And so part of that has to do with realistic expectations on the part of the spouse who's not a narcissist. If you want to stay married to this person, let's look at the positives you get out of that. How do we accentuate the positives? And how do we help you deal with the negatives? Those times when he just gets really selfish, thoughtless, doesn't think about you. He's not thinking ill of you. He just doesn't think about you. What are some ways you can deal with that? And so part of what and it's mostly women, part of what these women have to learn is this is who I married. He's not all bad. He's not all good. He has a lot of good traits, even though he's very selfish and very self-focused and self-absorbed. And if that woman chooses to stay married, then she has to learn how to not get her esteem needs met through that marriage. She has to learn how to have a good day even when he's not. She has to learn how to just kind of let it roll off her back. That's just him, right? That's just, that's Martha has to be able to say, that's George. He's just that way. He's always been that way. And not take it personally. There are different theories when it comes to marriage counseling. For the longest time, I subscribed to the communication theories. If we could just improve communication, the marriages would be great. But what I discovered was that for some marriages, we simply improved the rate at which they were being mean to one another. And so I've kind of come full circle back to where I started 42 years ago. And I think that one of the keys to marriage is individuation. I need to recognize that, yes, the two become one, but I'm still my own person. I don't have to give up everything I am and fit into your life. And that's what happens in these marriages, because that's what the narcissist wants. He wants everybody around him to fit into his life. She has to have enough strength of will to be able to say, yeah, I'm not going to do that, knowing that it's going to cause some blow-ups every now and then. But for a lot of women, it's worth it. The positives are worth it. And so part of it is when we have that narcissistic wound, we have to strike while the iron is hot, help him understand that it's not always her fault. Part of it is we have to help her readjust her expectations. The reality is you didn't marry the guy you thought you did. You didn't marry a happy, healthy, whole person. You married a guy who's a believer. He's a Christian. He's a nice guy most of the time, but he's self-absorbed and he's thoughtless. And a lot of women, maybe even most women, that's a deal breaker. But for some women, it's not. And they can learn how to be in that relationship.
So when you think about what you're sharing here, I ran across a guy who's a Christian psychologist, and he doesn't work with narcissists at all. He doesn't believe in working with a narcissistic type couples or a male. What is behind some people wanting to not work with narcissism? And it just seems odd that, okay, here you are, call yourself a Christian. Jesus worked with everybody. So why aren't some people working with narcissism? And is there hope for men who have been diagnosed with narcissism to be able to have hope within the marriage? We got about 5 minutes left, and we're going to leave you out on a cliffhanger, and we're going to pick it up in part 2. Go ahead and finish out, Bowden.
So I don't know the gentleman you're referring to, but like I said earlier, conventional wisdom in the psychological field suggests that personality disorders can't be changed. Right. And that's where I tell people, maybe I can't change them. God can. Let's not give up on God.
Right.
The second thing is, and I go back to my illustration of asthma or diabetes. If you have type 1 diabetes, juvenile diabetes, we don't have a cure for that. We can help you manage it, but we don't have a cure for it. The person with type 1 diabetes has to wake up every day and say to themselves, today I'm going to manage my glycemic index intake. I'm going to manage my sugar intake. I'm going to eat healthy. I'm going to get some exercise. And if I do that, I can live a pretty normal life. But that person can never walk into the bakery and sit down and just pig out, because there will be drastic consequences. A normal person can, right? There'll be consequences. I might feel sick at my stomach. I might put on a few pounds that are hard to get off, but it's not that my blood sugar is going to peak and then fall so low that I'm in a diabetic coma. The narcissist, or you mentioned borderline earlier, they have to wake up every day and say to themselves, I'm not normal. I have to work at thinking about others. Today, I'm going to think about others. Today, I'm going to try and imagine what someone else might be thinking as it relates to me. And they have to get up and do that every day. Just like the diabetic has to get up every day and say, today I'm going to limit my sugar intake. And so there is hope for these guys. You don't find too many men willing to do that. Mm-hmm. And so the second reason that this gentleman you're referring to, I would imagine, it's just hard work. It's hard work, right? There's a lot easier clients to work with.
So that is a great segue into defining hard work, into narcissism and, the hope for men. And that's what we want to do in part 2 is finding some good help tools that can assist couples that are in this dilemma. And so until next time, Bowden, I really appreciate it. We're going to pick up part 2 in just a moment, and we'll be back. But until next time, we'll see you next week. Take care.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode on Coach Soul. As we wrap up, we want to remind our listeners of a few key points. This podcast is for informational purposes only and does not substitute professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. The content shared here is based on professional opinion but may not apply to everyone's situation. Always consult with a qualified healthcare provider before making changes to your mental health care. If you're in a crisis, please seek immediate professional help or contact a crisis hotline. Listening to this podcast does not create a therapist-client relationship. For personal advice, please consult with your licensed mental health professional in your area. Remember, your mental health journey is unique. While we hope this information is helpful, it is crucial to work directly with the qualified personnel for your specific needs. Thank you again for tuning in to Coach Soul, and we'll see you next time.